because what someone experienced could be decades ago, could be affecting them now with the injury that you are here helping them regain functionality with, or compensate or remediate.
Welcome to the Fascia-Informed Therapist podcast, designed for health and wellness practitioners interested in fascia science. I'm Amy Mayer, occupational therapist, practice owner, author, and educator with more than 30 years of experience using fascia techniques across many settings. Each episode brings practical insights and thought-provoking conversations to help you expand your skills and better serve your clients. Let's get started. Hi, this is Amy, and this is another edition of the Fascia-Informed Therapist. And today I have Maddie with me, and we're going to do a discussion related to what I talked about a couple podcasts ago, and that was the discussion around childhood sexual trauma and its connection to pain as an adult. And when Maddie was a student with us, she did a part of her capstone and put together a really nice presentation on trauma and the brain. So Maddie's going to introduce herself and what she's going to talk about today.
Oh, thank you for that introduction, Amy. I am Dr. Madeline Seide. I'm an occupational therapist that contracts here with Mayer Fascia Wellness. And just like Amy said, I'm here to bring everyone into a soft launch into trauma and trauma-informed practice for practitioners. For our more experienced practitioners, this might be a little bit of a review. And for some of our non-practitioner listeners, this might be new information that you're able to take into your life, into your world, discuss these things with your PCM or your mental health care providers as well. So I'm really excited to get to share all that I've learned about this with everyone else.
And as we were talking about getting ready today to do this, you were telling me a little bit about some of the evaluations that you've done and in your conversations with your new clients and why they're seeking out care. That was really interesting. Can you share that again?
Yeah. So a lot of my new evaluations that I've had lately have come in because they've heard about fascia on social media, and they're curious about it because they hear these blips from people discussing it, and the most often thing I get asked is, does fascia store trauma in the body, or is my trauma stored in my fascia, or my memory stored in my fascia, and that's something I really love to discuss because it really helps bring in together this mind-body connection that we often become biased that those two things are separate. And what I like to discuss with my clients is that it's not necessarily that memories are stored within our fascial tissue, but as you've mentioned, Amy, in previous podcasts, that the way we position ourselves in moments of trauma can be protective or be a response to sort of mental health incidences or illness that come up over time. And because fascia is this moderator of our sensory system in our body, we find that our mind's ability to process that trauma is really connected to how we're experiencing what we feel in our body. So if we have less of that mind-body connection, are we able to really process and experience what we're feeling in our body when we are having a traumatic experience? And through, body work like myofascial release or other modalities that we use, can people, re-experience trauma or have an emotional response or reaction to what we do, to all of a sudden that be a reaction to feeling what they're experiencing in their body for the first time in a long time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, why don't you walk us through what you have to share today? I'm excited to hear your presentation again.
Yeah. So I wanted to start off by discussing a little bit about what trauma is, because I think there can be generational perspectives that differ with what trauma is, and how we typically define it is, an individual's trauma. It results from an event, a series of events, or sets of circumstances that are experienced by an individual, whether that be something that is experienced physically or emotionally, that is harmful or life-threatening. And these experiences can have long-term, long-lasting effects on not just, mental functioning, but physical, social, emotional, general well-being overall, even spiritual effects. And so we break down trauma into kind of three parts, which we call the 3 E's of trauma. So this would be, the first one is event. So that would be whether it's extreme physical or psychological harm or neglect. So this could be, exposure to traumatic circumstances, periods of extreme stress, and the event can vary person to person. We can't put the events of trauma in one particular box. It can be experienced through so many different things. And I think generational differences in understanding around that is previously, trauma was something that happened to soldiers. And, with the roots of occupational therapy being that the whole profession was founded after World War I to help treat soldiers with shell shock, there are some differences in perspective that trauma has to come from extreme circumstances such as war, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from extreme circumstances like that. There are people who are involved in natural disasters that experience trauma, where they are uprooted from their life and separated and have a lack of their occupations that they were previously conducting. And that separation from their environment, their experience, their roles and routines, and all these things that make our occupations, that connection of what is meaningful and purposeful in our lives, that those stressful events can be traumatic experiences as well. Not to mention, I know you've done some work discussing, childhood sexual abuse and the effects of that. That could absolutely be one of these stressful or traumatic experiences that is the event that causes someone distress.
And it could be a series of events that can go on for a long period of time, too, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So it could be just one, but it could also be that long-term stress from series of events or circumstances. So the first one was event. The second E is experience. So this means that the events may not be traumatic across the board from one person to another. So if we're talking about, soldiers in war, you may not have soldiers who have been in the exact same situation experiencing the same type of traumatic response after the particular event, even if they were in that event together. You find the same phenomena from children who live in the same home. One of them may be experiencing the effects from the event in a more enhanced way than the other. So it's not just the event, it's how the individual experiences that event as well, which is a subjective experience for each person.
I actually have a client who is exactly that. She and her sister is very traumatized by her childhood, and my client is not, and they don't understand each other's experiences. It's so interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's another misperception or misconception that people have around trauma is, well, we had the same experiences or these same events happen to us growing up, and if I don't feel this way, how could you feel this way?
Same parents, same siblings, yes.
Yeah, and it creates this disconnect between how we're able to connect with other people about these experiences, especially when we know intimately what happened or, how we felt in the moment. But experience is subjective. How we're responding to something is unique to each individual. And then the final E in the 3 E's of what is trauma is effects. So this is, the detrimental effects, whether they occur immediately after or with a delayed onset to that traumatic experience stemming from the event. So we have the event, which is what happened. We have the experience, which is unique to each individual. And then you have the effects of what that person is experiencing and how that can affect you not just in the moment, but with a delayed onset or continually throughout the lifespan as well. And it's pretty unique because, we talk about this stuff and we wonder, there are some people that say, well, why should we care about this? But my dad's favorite phrase is, Matt, everyone's got trauma. And in a way, he's right. Because in studies, almost 90% of adults in the United States report having exposure to a traumatic event or many traumatic events throughout their life. Now, just because a traumatic event happens to you does not necessarily mean that what you're experiencing after is traumatic. Again, that's unique to each individual. But that also can create that disconnect between, events happen, but I respond to it in a way that's different from how you respond to it. And those things aren't necessarily in our control. A lot of it happens to be influenced by our genetics and by our physiology and by our environment and our social structures that surround us around, after, and throughout our lifespan from an event.
Could it also be experiences that you had leading up to that trauma? Or maybe, like we talk about with fascia, one injury on top of another injury on top of another injury often makes that third injury the after effects of that injury even worse because of those other layers of physical trauma. Can your trauma, the trauma that you're talking about, if there's been a series of, can that make the response potentially even worse than for the other trauma? Is my question even clear?
No, it's absolutely clear. And it's interesting that you bring this up because a lot of the studies that are done on traumatic events involve studying people with post-traumatic stress disorders. And what they find with people who have post-traumatic stress disorders, they have a history of having traumatic events throughout their life, sometimes stemming in childhood, sometimes stemming in young adulthood. But they actually found that the trauma that we experience previously, if we do feel trauma from these events, it makes us more likely to be re-traumatized by events later on in life. And that makes us have a higher rate of acquiring post-traumatic stress disorder later on in life.
So earlier when you were talking about the soldiers in war could be at the same place at the same time experiencing the same event, but one is maybe less affected with post-traumatic stress than another one, or another one may not have it at all. It could be the soldier that came into the war maybe came from a home that maybe had an abusive parent or something, and if they had those layers coming into that experience, that might be one of the causes of how it and why it affected them differently?
Yeah, that could absolutely be a contributing factor. And interestingly enough, not just the things that have happened to you, but the structures around you as you're responding to a traumatic event also. So say that, you didn't have these precursors and then you encountered a horrible or harmful event. Well, we've actually found that how you are supported socially affects how we are responding and recovering from trauma in real time as well. So not just what happened prior to the event, but what happens after the event. Okay. What resources are there to almost debrief you from the event? What factors of resiliency do you have, whether it be through having a really dynamic social support system or having the ability to seek treatment, after the event. We talk about access to healthcare and, social detriments of health and things of that nature. Is a person able to respond with resources to what they're experiencing, or are they kind of left to the winds? Mm-hmm. And I think it's difficult for people who are not experiencing those things within a person to understand that. And I think one of the things I talk about often with my friends when we talk about, traumatic events or experiences and, how that relates to patients that we see, it's that sometimes it's easy to sum up that someone just can't get their shit together. Pardon my French. But beep. Yeah, beep. But it's easy to put that experience under an umbrella with that person just can't get their shit together. Why can't they just, step away from, smoking or step away from alcohol, or, why do they always fall back into these patterns? And what that person is experiencing and what resources they have, this is so much more a dynamic experience of multiple things that have happened throughout their life, whether it be from potential previous traumas or a failure to have them connected with resources or social supports. So sometimes for me, it's easy to compare trauma to a virus. And just like with, inoculations that we can have, are there ways that we can inoculate ourselves to experiencing something that turns into adverse effects over time? And so addressing trauma that happens throughout the lifespan, especially when children are young. And I think we see children as very resilient beings. They fall, they get back up, and we think that, their nervous systems respond in the same way, but not everyone's nervous system responds the same. And care and attention to traumatic experiences in childhood could potentially have long-lasting effects throughout the lifespan when we talk about the detrimental effects of trauma later on in life when it comes to disease and health outcomes.
I hope I'm not getting you too far off track of what we intended to talk about today, but is it all flowing?
Yeah, okay. We're flowing.
Okay, great.
And I guess kind of my point, what I'm trying to make here is that trauma isn't just, something that occurs, in our mind. This is really something that affects mind, body, spirit, social, financial, all of these elements of our life that we handle as adults. Trauma has the potential to affect that. And there are different, kinds, whether it be through, an individual's unique trauma or traumatic events that have happened, or whether it's, interpersonal trauma with relationships, or, we think about collective trauma that could be from war or, a group of refugees fleeing from the same kind of threat. But there are even things like historical trauma, where we talk about maybe the traumatic event didn't happen to that person, but knowing that, historically there were threats to your family, and then being around people who have experienced that and integrating that. And then perhaps there are structures set up that support systemic trauma, historical trauma. I think one of the things I think about most often is, historical trauma related to slavery. Mm-hmm. And while a person who is alive today may not have directly experienced slavery, we are still dealing with these systemic ripple effects of redlining and, food deserts and, a million other things that affect a person's ability to live and thrive and participate in the same ways that people who have not been historically affected by those things or had systems set up that, are oppressive, are able to.
Just to insert, I read a book a while back as part of a book group called My Grandmother's Hands, and they talked about exactly that. I wish I could remember the author's name, but it was such an incredibly eye-opening, wonderful book that talks about just what you just talked about. I would highly recommend it, My Grandmother's Hands.
Yeah. And it's interesting also because these things don't just happen through experience or through how systems are set up, but they also change us at a physiological level, whether that be through epigenetic changes that occur generation to generation in response to experiences. Our bodies tend to adapt and change themselves with what they are experiencing in the world. Mm-hmm. But these changes don't just happen, in our genes, they also happen to the physiological structures of our brains. Our brains can be changed whether it be through the activities in certain areas of the brain, or whether it be through actual physiological changes in volume or size of structures within the brain. I think about the amygdala, which is the emotion processing center of the brain, and how its relationship to trauma is that trauma actually can increase connectivity and activity in the amygdala. So sometimes we see people who have a history of trauma and there is emotional dysregulation there, whether their responses to new experiences or events seem enhanced or seem flattened. So the amygdala is important to that. And then we talk about the hippocampus, which is the memory and learning hub of the brain. When traumatic experiences happen, what can happen to the brain is that the hippocampus can decrease in volume. So we have an increase of connectivity to the amygdala, creating potential enhancements of how we're experiencing emotion and a dysregulation in the emotion processing. And then we have a reduction in memory and learning. So I think about, that person just can't get their shit together phrase. Well, if your memory and your learning are affected and that part of the brain is reduced in size, could that be a contributing factor to why they're not able to adapt to their environment or adapt to their circumstances, even if the direct threat does not appear to be there any longer? Are they able to recall instances of resilience and draw from those memories to create this resilient kind of personality to their lives, or feel like they're able to learn and grow? With those two parts of the brain affected, when we frame it that way, that person just can't get their shit together. All of a sudden looks like we are fighting an uphill battle with how the brain has restructured itself. We also see the prefrontal cortex in the brain, which is responsible for a lot of our executive functions and our personality. And we find that trauma can reduce activation to that executive functioning part of the brain also. So we talk about things like impulsiveness that can be, experienced by someone who's responding to a traumatic experience, and how the prefrontal cortex would be related to that. But we also look at, other areas of the brain like the anterior cingulate cortex or the posterior cingulate cortex, which is kind of a dynamic area when we talk about the default mode network of the brain, which I'm sure we'll get to a little bit later in this conversation. But we actually find that these areas are affected in their function and their size, and it really happens to hone in on issues with emotion experience, emotion processing, memory, personality, regulation, motivation, and how these altered connectivities, densities, and structure sizes really do impact how we experience the world around us and respond to it appropriately.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking about people that I know and people who I know that have a history of trauma and sort of how they go through life. And I'm thinking about what's happening in their brain. and it sort of matches up. It's so interesting. Okay, great. Keep going, Maddie.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the brain's weightlifting capacity. And when I talk about the brain's weightlifting capacity, it's not necessarily talking about how the brain can, contribute to our muscle strength. But just like everybody's body is different, everybody's body can handle different amounts of physical load on it. Everybody's brain has different abilities to handle stress, trauma, events that are happening in their life. And this is what we call the allostatic load. So the allostatic load is what's defined as the cumulative burden of stress on the body measured by these physiological markers. So when it comes to maintaining homeostasis in the body, that's, pairing up the body's ability to cope with these stressors with the right amount of stress load so that you're able to handle what you are experiencing. But trauma affects the allostatic load of the brain, and not everybody has the same allostatic load. This could be connected to why each experience is experienced differently to each individual, because everybody's allostatic load is different. The amount that they're able to handle, but that their autonomic nervous system is able to handle is different, whether it be through its links to general well-being or functionality, or overall mortality even. We find that the different allostatic loads that people have and how they're able to handle that like wear and tear on their mind and their body with each traumatic event they experience is different, and that the stress cycle itself is influenced not just by these environmental factors that happen with each event, but also personal factors as well. And so what we can find here is that there is a delayed impact of trauma. So individuals that may be able to cope initially to a traumatic or a stressful event may still experience physical effects later on from the coping that they're able to handle. So they may be on the outside looking like they're handling this experience in stride, but what's happening internally and physiologically and in the brain may tell a different story down the line. And one of the more interesting things when I compare trauma to a virus, one of the reasons why I say that is because trauma has this ability to lay dormant in our bodies and then manifest itself over time without the effects of immediate post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms on the body. So, I talk about kids being able to bounce back really easily from things, or even, adults that seem resilient. That doesn't necessarily mean that these events didn't affect them. We may find that an experience later on down the line really triggers something that was never completely processed. And so that trauma can lie dormant and come back up at different periods of time. I think a lot about people who experienced physical harm in their childhood, and that may be associated with feelings of helplessness. Now, maybe they've coped with that throughout their entire life. Maybe that has been a back burner thought that they haven't really connected with. But what happens when they age and they have a stroke? And all of a sudden, that feeling of helplessness has returned because they're not able to defend themselves or care for themselves or have a level of functioning independence. That can absolutely be a trigger to trauma that happened in childhood. And that's why I think that OT is such a unique place to step in when it comes to trauma-informed care, because what someone experienced could be decades ago, could be affecting them now with the injury that you are here helping them regain functionality with, or compensate or remediate certain roles or routines or activities.
Yeah, I never thought of it in that capacity of recurring after a stroke. So, that's really fascinating to me to think that through. How that could, those same sensations they would have had elsewhere about helplessness reoccurring when suddenly I'm helpless, when I haven't been my whole life. Wow. Okay. Keep going.
Yeah. And to be a little,
So interesting.
have some candor here. I recently had an injury where I was not able to run. So for those that may not know, I tore my ACL back in September. And my personal experience with that was I needed more mental health help related to that than I needed almost the physical rehabilitation. I think that whether it be from, being told my whole life, always be on your toes, or maybe it has something to do with, my history as, having served in the Army and always being ready to move because danger could be around any corner. Or maybe even from the experience of being a woman where, you're walking alone at night and you may need to run for your life. Any of those things could have been related to that. But the feeling of all of a sudden not being physically able to run for my life, it affected me a lot more than I had initially anticipated the injury would. I thought I'd be sad because I wasn't able to do my activities. But what I found that was happening was I found myself being scared
Oh, wow.
and
Maddie.
feeling
Interesting.
helpless more often than I had previously. And that's just my own personal experience with that. But I think a lot about OT's role in helping someone recover from injury or remediate lost skills from injury, and why we should be considering trauma at every corner, because we really don't know someone's past and how that may be affecting their mental health as they navigate those new abilities that they have.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about trauma and the body, and how, trauma can affect the body through coming up with that cortical physical connection and consequence through somatization of what they're experiencing and unexplained pain. But it could also come up through chronic disorders of aging. I talk about, the initial injury of having a stroke, but, all of a sudden, you're walking and you're not navigating spaces as effectively anymore. Or chronic disorders of aging, I think a lot about loss of vision over time. And, how independence is important to so many people, and how that change in the body can have a traumatic effect on them as they learn to navigate their environments and their roles with new abilities. But also talking about the long-term health impacts that stem directly from trauma. So we find that those who report having trauma in their past also have histories of hypertension as they age, hyperlipidemia as they age, things like obesity and heart disease and musculoskeletal pain and headaches, GI issues and sleep disorders and disturbances. Now pair that all together, layer it on to the human experience, and how that in and of itself is never easy. Like, life leaves no one unscathed.
So true.
Now layer those on. Now layer on this mind-body connection and relate it back to traumatic events that happen early on in life. We find that childhood trauma in particular can actually predict physical disorders, even when you control for lifestyle factors or demographics. So it has nothing to do with where someone grew up or if they exercise, but that childhood trauma in and of itself can be predictive of having health issues as life progresses. And I think learning that alone kind of blew my mind, and it shifted how I saw people in my practice. It changed my world completely. It reshaped all of these things that we assign a lot of personal responsibility to. And there is elements of personal responsibility, whether it be through diet or exercise or, we all know that we should eat more vegetables and go for a walk every now and again. But it's more than that. We each start at different places. We each experience different things, and there are different hang-ups for each of us in this race of life that we run.
Yeah, change. So you're essentially saying changing your lifestyle factors doesn't guarantee that you're going to be protecting yourself from this future issues that are being caused by trauma.
Yes, and when I say that, that doesn't mean I'm saying don't exercise because it can't do anything for you anyways, because you've already been set back in the race. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But I am saying is that
it's not a guarantee.
It's not a guarantee. Yeah. And these things are contributing factors. And perhaps we should treat trauma and traumatic experiences in the same way that we treat public health concerns before. Maybe trauma should be a public health concern, and maybe we should address it with public health policy and resources.
I 100% agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. So, would putting money towards investing in a greater amount of mental health practitioners in different settings be beneficial? Would creating public resources and people who respond to these events that children go through be protective for them in the long term and affect their long-term well-being? Would that, in theory, take financial burden off the healthcare system as people age? Would people have a greater quality of life? Would they have a greater ability to participate in work and in the economy? And this is me putting on my economist hat here. But, sometimes we have to word it from, how would this affect our society? Well, the financial burden of trauma is so much greater than...
It's huge.
Lump all those things together.
Massive.
Lump in the effects of heart disease. Lump in the effects of obesity. Lump in the effects of chronic pain. And we're looking at a multi-billion-dollar weight on the system that could potentially be partially lifted by addressing trauma early on in life and throughout the lifespan as these events happen.
Yes. Yeah, I talked a little bit about the financial burden of childhood trauma in the podcast before. It's massive, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah. And on top of that, we talk about quality of life and how, people may have immediate reactions to trauma, but those reactions might persist as well. So whether that be through experiencing things like exhaustion or confusion or sadness or agitation, how we refer to ourselves. Think about that default mode network, how our brain experiences itself at rest. What would the impact be if we had 10% less negative self-referential thoughts when we think about ourselves? Mm-hmm. What would the impact of that be? What would the impact be of the cognitive emotional changes that happen through trauma, like, having intrusive thoughts or negative moods or cognitive difficulties, emotional loneliness, detachment? What would the impact be if we addressed those things as an aspect of the traumatic whole instead of as individual pockets of, well, let's cope with this here, let's cope with this here. And those are all helpful. But let's look at it under the umbrella and take a more holistic perspective. This is one of the reasons why I love being an OT talking about this, because by definition, our entire scope of practice is holistic. We really do take a moment to look at the whole person, which is why I'm such a proponent of, having OTs in mental health and expanding the role of OTs in mental health in every state that we could possibly advocate for that for. Because what would the outcome be to affect the well-being of the populations of the states that we serve through the OT community? Mm-hmm. There's a time and place for ADL training. Heck yeah, ADL training. Everyone needs to use the bathroom and to feed themselves and to do self-care. And OT's roles have the potential to be so much more beautiful and dynamic and affect people in ways so much further beyond toileting and bathing.
Yes.
So I want to talk a little bit about trauma and how it can impact us socially. I think I've mentioned before that, trauma has a relationship to emotional loneliness, but it also has this interesting effect where it can alter our worldview. Sometimes I think about people who may be experiencing trauma and their perspective of the world can seem very dark. And while in a way that may feel realistic, it may not be protective. And negative worldviews, alienation from their communities, and estrangement all have a potential to link back to these negative health outcomes when it comes to physical health too.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We think about people as they age and how we know, socialization and the role of your friends and your community are so important as you age, not just to drive you to and from appointments, but to keep you involved socially. And the same goes for people who've experienced trauma. A lot of times there can be this self-isolation that occurs afterwards, or this kind of receding into oneself and making their world small because the world they've experienced has done harm to them in a way, or has created this impression that they will never overcome this experience. And so they need to recede into themselves to protect themselves. You think about that guarding posture, that affects our fascial tissue. But we also see issues, especially with post-traumatic stress disorder, linking to impairments in those relationships, so much more than just the isolation portion. But when it comes to issues with physical and emotional intimacy, our ability to connect with other people, our ability to feel safe with other people, to really be with one another. We talk about communication breakdown that happens because of things like trauma. And we also talk about behavioral changes like things like increased anger. If we look at the effects of trauma on the rates of domestic violence in the United States and the long-term effects of both abuser and victim in these circumstances, is trauma at the root a potential cause of these instances, and therefore creating more trauma through this cycle of domestic violence? That's one of the things I think about often. And another way to advocate for OT in areas where we are responding to instances like that, or having OTs present in businesses and nonprofits that really do support the interpersonal violence experience and recovery from that. So when we talk about the social impacts, we can also talk about how that affects children also. And what we find with children is that there's a huge risk for social exclusion when trauma has been present in their lives, and how early instances of trauma actually increased risk for social exclusion with those children too. And that the more trauma or neglect that a child experiences, there is a greater level of social withdrawal that occurs. Now expand that over the lifespan.
Right. Yeah.
And we see this like multiplier effect that happens from not being there to respond to these traumatic experiences. And we find that there is something incredibly powerful about responding, even if it doesn't look like there's a problem there. Trauma is kind of like a natural gas leak. Like, you may not see it. It does not mean that it will not affect you. It does not mean that you're not in danger. It does not mean that you will not have to deal with this later on. It's quite insidious. And that doesn't mean we need to wrap our children in bubble wrap and protect them from every bad thing that will ever happen to them. But providing them support when bad things happen, aiding in the prevention of keeping bad things from happening as we're able to, and then providing them with resources and support going forward where they're able to access care for themselves and address deficits as they come up later on down the line. Could that potentially impact their health and well-being over time, their ability to participate in their lives, in their relationships, in their communities? It's a resounding thought. But now I want to talk about spirituality.
Please.
And I say it with a whisper because I do enjoy talking about some woo-woo stuff here or there.
Okay.
But I also want to talk about how this relates to trauma and how it impacts that. And I think there's another misconception where religiousness or religious faith and spirituality are superimposed on one another. And I feel like there's not a lot of understanding that, religion and spirituality, although they can overlap, they also exist in their own individual spheres. Yes. So if I were to talk about spirituality with a client with trauma, they might respond with, well, I don't go to church. But that isn't necessarily what the spirituality is focusing on or related to. So one of the definitions that I found about spirituality is that spirituality is the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose in the way they experience connections. Mm-hmm. And to me, that sounds a lot like OT. Because when we think about doing anything OT-wise, because it has meaning, because it has purpose, because it brings dignity, because it connects them with their experience around them, regardless of their abilities, and how these forms of occupational justice really do affect aspects of spirituality in your life. So I think about, things that bring you meaning and purpose. Some people may find that being a parent brings them meaning and purpose. And so being able to conduct themselves to the highest ability that they have in the role of being a parent is their expression of spirituality. This may sound kind of silly when I say it, but I think of an old man with a great lawn. And I think about that old man may say, I'm not religious. Or, I find my connection through faith. And maybe that's true, but we find that if they're injured and they're all of a sudden not able to do lawn work that previously brought them a lot of meaning and purpose and caring for something and making it beautiful, how is that not, to me, an expression of their spirituality?
I had that client.
Yeah.
And he got back to mowing his lawn.
And when I think about that, it's, spirituality can be expressed in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. And just like trauma can affect so many different aspects of our lives, its impact on how we participate in things that bring us meaning and purpose is absolutely an impact to our spirituality. And we find that trauma can really stunt that search for meaning and purpose and spirituality. And while religion might be that way that people express meaning and purpose throughout their life, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you are not religious that you can't find that meaning and purpose.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
And having traumatic experiences might contribute to a deficit of finding meaning and purpose in your activities or aspects of your life or bits of connection that may not have been as difficult to find if you were not dealing with the impacts of trauma. The cognitive, the emotional, the psychological, all of that. So we talk about this aspect of spirituality and healing. We find that restoring meaning can aid in trauma recovery. Hello, OT. OT makes an appearance again, everyone. But again, it's so much more. Our occupations are so much more than what we do. And they're so much more than chores. They're so much more than things that we can assign to other people. Participation in the things that are meaningful to us, that is spirituality. That is OT. And in my mind, I see this Venn diagram. On one side is OT and one side is spirituality. And we find this huge overlap in the center between the two. And it's another one of the reasons why I think OT should be in every area of healthcare and be used for its dynamic purpose. Because I feel, personally, that OT is the secret sauce to addressing trauma in individuals, communities, and populations across the United States.
Wow, that sounds like a whole nother podcast topic right there. If we can connect it back to fascia. Which everything connects back to fascia.
Everything connects back to fascia. So before we go on to talking about the default mode network, I wanted to talk a little bit about coping. Because a lot of the times when it comes to trauma or conditions that could be comorbid with trauma, like depression or anxiety, things like coping comes up a lot with, well, they're just not coping appropriately or they need more tools. And all of those things could potentially be true. Coping and disordered stress responses are so much more dynamic than just one thing or another. Things like your family history of stress disorders, previous mental illnesses, family history of mental illnesses, things like substance abuse can all be these risk factors for having severe traumatic responses. And how trauma exposure, history of abuse, and toxic stress are all areas that can affect that, but also the lack of support systems can be a huge factor in that, whether it be with children experiencing trauma or adults. So I come back to the soldier discussion, where the soldiers may experience the same traumatic event, even if they have a similar history of going through childhood. Maybe they both do not have trauma in their childhood, but what does their support system look like coming out of that experience? Does one soldier have a family that is able to respond? Do they have friends in an area that they're able to talk to? Does the other one not? Could those lack of support systems influence coping and disordered stress response? Absolutely. So it's not just about what happens or your history, but what resources you have set up after that can affect how that trauma presents itself in your life and long term. So how can we, integrate coping strategies to help people who have experienced trauma? Well, a lot of the research focuses on successful coping strategies that involve maintaining your daily activities. Hello, OT makes an appearance again. And getting you back to your daily activities if those have been impacted by, an illness or an injury. Working on aspects of self-regulation and self-esteem, and then also the preservation of your interpersonal relationships. And really honing in on the fact that people need people. People need supportive people in their lives, and that those are incredibly important when it comes to coping strategies, not just because those individuals are how we cope, but it's really how we spread out the burden of life, is by having one another to lean on and to share our experience with, and to have that person be a witness to our experiences in life and show genuine care and affection towards us in our time of need.
The phrase "takes a village" comes to mind.
I think "takes a village" is so much more powerful than we give it credit for.
Yeah.
Because it really does. No one makes it out of life unscathed. He who makes it to the end with the most friends. Or maybe not even the most. The highest quality.
Yeah.
The highest quality of your relationships.
Yes.
And how safe you feel to be yourself and to be a person who can experience life and not feel judged. I think about the friends that are there with us through our hardest times. We think about the people that get us through these moments in life. And I really do think that every person deserves to have those people around them. Even if it's one or two, the impact of having those people around us is vast.
Yeah, sharing the burden of life. I like that.
Yeah. It can really turn our own personal kiddie pool into an ocean. Maybe that was a weird analogy. But, when you have a friend that really knows you and knows your depths, that's what it can feel like. It can feel expansive compared to feeling alone in a crowded room.
Yeah.
Coming back to coping and its relationship to spirituality and religion, one of the pieces of literature that I was looking into stated that both spirituality and religion have shown to be positive coping mechanisms for traumatic events and stressful experiences. This isn't me telling you to go out and find a religion. This isn't me telling you to go pick a god and go choose your team and align yourself there. But if you are already engaged in religion and you find purpose and meaning through participating in that, yeah, there are huge aspects of that can be helpful. So whether your spirituality is mowing your lawn every other day, fertilizing it, and watering it and caring for that, or whether it's through, engaging in community at your local church and volunteering, or, being able to engage in prayer and creating that connection between you and what you feel is your higher power. All of those things can be protective and positive coping mechanisms compared to some of the negative ones that we might see, whether it be through substance abuse or isolation. Let's go back and let's revisit childhood experience.
Okay.
And how trauma impacts children. I don't know if you knew this, Amy, but I once was a child.
Really? Me too. Yeah. Me too.
You would have never thought.
Wow.
And you would never think by looking at everyone around you that everyone was once a child that required the support and aid of adults around them. Mm-hmm. We see individuals as being these, non-player characters all walking around. And it's been helpful for me to envision someone as a child, not to infantilize them, but to really engage with their experience and understand that whatever happened in those periods of developmental years could have long-term impacts. It really isn't, they just are the way they are. We're all built from the things that we experience. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about trauma and development, there can be a massive physical and mental health impact from trauma in your developing years in childhood up to age, 25 to 30 roughly is where we think that the brain finally is able to create its adult level connectivity. We find that adolescence lasts much longer than we previously thought. When we talk about childhood trauma in particular, we find that it's linked to those physical ailments in adulthood, like I mentioned earlier. And that was even with controlling for those socio-demographic and lifestyle factors. But as I mentioned earlier also, it increases those risks for comorbid trauma disorders later in life, like post-traumatic stress disorder. And so those brain and stress response alterations, trauma in those early years increases that brain connectivity that I was mentioning, so that increased connectivity and activity in the amygdala, and then the shrinking of the hippocampus. Those things can lead to aspects of hypervigilance and negative self-referencing patterns. So not only does it affect how we respond to things around us, things feel more dangerous, it changes how we respond to ourselves. That internal self-talk that we create, that begins in childhood. And these negative patterns of self-referencing begin in childhood, potentially with traumatic experiences. And what we find is that those patterns can contribute to things like symptoms of anxiety later on in adulthood. And those alterations in stress response systems through those changes in the brain can cause both delayed and prolonged effects on well-being. I think I discussed, diseases as being kind of that, the thing that kind of perks people's ears up most often. But let's talk more about like those psychosocial and those workplace outcomes, your ability to make friends over your lifespan, your ability to be in a workplace and experience the allostatic load of having a job, managing coworkers, managing interpersonal relationships that, some days may be better than others.
Being part of a team.
Yeah.
Co-working.
Exactly. And so with those psychosocial outcomes and those workplace outcomes, sadly enough, we see that childhood trauma can actually contribute to an increased risk of suicidality. And that's in both genders. That is not separated, male to female. There is no one, and everyone in between, there is nothing left unscathed from these impacts. And so that negative self-referencing, that increased risk of suicidality, those affect work functioning. It affects how much work you miss. It affects how present you are at work. Again, putting on my economist hat, thinking about how many billions of dollars are lost from people not showing up to work or from people not being present and conducting work when work is to be had. So when we talk about a call to action around these things, I think that things like trauma-informed interventions that affect both physical and mental health aspects should be implemented to affect development across the lifespan and the ability to participate in social aspects of your life and work aspects of your life later on down your timeline. We kind of back it up here to talk about the default mode network. This is your brain's default setting. When you are just sitting, not doing anything, this is the default mode of your brain. I mean, that sounds like a pretty good name for the network, doesn't it? Since it is default mode. But it's this intrinsic network of the brain, and it's responsible for your autobiographical memory processing. So understanding your past experiences and how that relates to your future experience. And like I mentioned, those self-referential processes. So that's the insight into yourself, but also the insight into others. So if, we have someone whose default mode network has been affected in childhood by trauma, not only are they not able to connect with themselves, it's harder for them to understand the experience of others also. Let's take into consideration, their ability to empathize with others' experiences or understand others' emotions, and how that plays into all these aspects of how trauma can impact individuals and groups later on. But we also find that trauma's impact on the sense of self, it affects both the cognitive self-awareness and the somatic self-awareness. So the way that we feel in our bodies and in our minds, and that connection between those two, that is impacted through the default mode network alterations that occur with someone who has traumatic experiences that are not handled, helped, well-resourced, well-coped with, etc., versus someone who, may have experienced something like that and has resources, has a team of people to respond to that, whether it be through healthcare or through social aspects or through, a work that is supportive of them, taking some time off to meet mental health needs or things like that. But we find that if that default mode network is altered in childhood, a lot of the comparisons for the default mode network are either with people who have childhood trauma or people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. These effects, we find that it contributes to issues with resting state connectivity. So what areas of the brain are lighting up when we're not doing anything? And so when your brain is resting, but the connectivity is on that says threat is nearby and present, all of a sudden this contributes to increase in cortisol, which is that stress response hormone. And that's not to necessarily physical threats. That's from things like social threats also. So all of a sudden, if you've had a history of trauma and that default mode network has been altered, your resting state of your brain says, I am always in danger. And that danger is felt if someone looked at me funny. That danger is felt if someone laughed at me. Those responses to stress and threat are all of a sudden hyper aroused in our brain's resting state. There isn't a space for us to slow down and evaluate if that threat is actually threatening, or if that thought perhaps is a misperception, or if it mattered at all. Do I care if that stranger looked at me funny? Mm-hmm. What, do I have broccoli in my teeth? Did I put my shirt on inside out? All of those aspects, there is not that period of reflection. There is only threat. And so because the default mode network matures in childhood and early adulthood, those alterations to that default mode network and how we respond to threats, not just physical ones, but social ones also, those are what predispose us to having PTSD later in life is most related to. is how that network and that connectivity is altered.
Okay.
So before we finish up, we have kind of fire hosed you all with all of this information about trauma and the brain, but let's talk a little bit provider to provider here and talk a little bit about informing a trauma-informed practice. And so I think the first part of contributing to resolving this kind of public health concern of how trauma affects everybody, first we need to recognize how prevalent it is.
Yes.
We talk about all of these things like individual factors, like, individual factors related to substance abuse or, childhood, trauma or relationship violence. We talk about these things in pockets, relating it all back to how trauma has impacted individuals, I think is the first part. And understanding that everyone you encounter was once a child and has potentially had a traumatic experience that's going to affect how they hear, understand, process, respond to you, the healthcare provider, or anyone around them. We understand how its widespread impact throughout communities and populations can affect not just individuals, but groups as a whole. And how if we develop trauma-sensitive and trauma-responsive services, perhaps we can impact well-being on a more holistic scale than just treating symptoms of a problem instead of addressing the root and providing resources for individuals to grow and respond and understand themselves and their experiences also, connecting them back to themselves. It kind of brings into mind a truly trauma-informed response really seeks to recognize those disparities and the prevalence of this trauma exposure. But that also comes with, evaluating things that are really uncomfortable in society, like poverty and discrimination and social detriments of health that really contribute to this kind of collective trauma that groups of people experience. But it involves having to stare the ugly things in the face, the things that we don't want to see or address because it hurts us to think that our world has these faults. But staring those things in the face and saying we need support in these areas, these are the first steps of advocacy in healthcare overall, not just with OT. Becoming trauma-informed, we want to have an awareness of what trauma is. We want to have the awareness of its prevalence and how it presents in others and how that can be different, individual to individual. We should be seeking out continued education related to current research related to trauma. And we want that continued education on communities that are likely impacted by trauma. So whether that be through looking at studies specifically on women or specifically on children. There's a lot of studies about trauma as it's related to the military, and that's wonderful. We should expand on those. But let's do some on domestic violence victims and incarcerated peoples. And we haven't even touched on how the physical aspects of injury can affect that too, like brain injury and trauma and the connection between the two. That's for a whole nother podcast, Amy. I look forward to being back to discuss that.
Great.
So let's all take a step forward by advocating for appropriate trauma screening and assessments in the settings that we're in. Let's take a collaborative and strength-based approach to occupational therapy or physical therapy or, primary care, whatever area that you are working in. Let's take a strength-based approach to interventions that happen there. Let's learn, core principles of trauma-informed care and anticipate the need for strategies or treatment plans from that trauma-informed perspective. But one of the most important things we can do is avoid re-traumatizing our patients, our clients, our peers. And that happens through educating ourselves, our staff, by implementing procedures and policies to avoid those things from happening. And then constantly reevaluate and rebuild. And if you see something isn't working or isn't working effectively, don't be afraid to tear it down and start anew and try to find a better way for it to work. But I'll leave us with the very basic parts of trauma-informed care, which is the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. The first R is realization. So realization is realizing facts about trauma and how it can affect people and groups. The second R is recognize. So this is recognizing those signs of trauma, whether it be through the manifestation of substance abuse or poor coping or hypervigilance or fear response. The third R is respond. So responding is really having a system that can respond appropriately to trauma. Are you operating as one person, or can you expand to have a team that's able to be there, that you're able to refer out to if you need to respond to trauma on a greater scale and require more support for the individuals that may be experiencing it? The last R, as I mentioned before, was resist re-traumatization. So we, as a person in healthcare, do not want to re-traumatize the person through our experience with them. And so this is kind of that tiptoe experience. And while we seek to do no harm, there's a lot of ways we can inadvertently re-traumatize our clients or our patients, whether that be through physical touch without consent, whether that be through not making them feel listened to or cared about, or by disenfranchising them, by not allowing them to be a part of their own healthcare process. All of those things can be aspects of how re-traumatization can happen in the healthcare system. So as we move forward with continued advocacy, I encourage everyone to have continued advocacy within themselves by finding resources and continuing education on trauma-informed practices and approaches for your individual fields that you're in. I encourage you to have continued advocacy with others, to be open with your loved ones and those you care about, your colleagues and those around you. That doesn't necessarily mean telling them everything about yourself or every trauma that you've had, but being a person who's open to receiving that social experience as you are able to. That village. Mm-hmm. It really does take a village. And when we talk about supporting our peers in society, everyone is a peer to you. Whether they have the same education or live in the same neighborhood or, work in the same field, everyone is a peer to you, from the barista that makes your coffee in the morning to the person who teaches your kid at school. Everyone is a peer to everybody. So we have a role to play in this village with how we respond and care for those around us. We can all participate in the collective support system, even if we're not there holding someone's hand directly. We create the culture of support that can help repair this disconnect in our society where we see people as individuals who just can't get their shit together versus this is a social problem and we have the power to affect it with every interaction that we have throughout our days. And then within healthcare, continued advocacy for the applications of trauma-informed principles in every single care setting and looking at the patient through a holistic lens and not just their symptoms.
How about if we wrap up with maybe a short discussion on how we provide trauma-informed care here in our practice, and maybe it'll give some people some other things, very practical things to think about in addition to what you've already shared.
Yeah.
And I guess the first one I would say is, you mentioned this already, is we ask.
Yeah.
we ask about it and are willing to have a discussion about it. And, we act as that peer and we listen and we don't rush. We never rush our evaluations. We listen to the stories and let them drive that conversation would be one, right? Another one would be, I'm sitting in the guest chair right now in the treatment room, and we put that chair by the door so they don't feel like they're in here cornered, for example, because there is another chair that is kind of back in the corner, but that's one we use when we're treating. But that would be another one.
Yeah.
I've had clients who did not want any music on. They had a traumatic experience with a massage therapist one time, so they wanted the room well lit, no music, and as unlike a massage room as possible. I've had other clients who really don't like particular kinds of music, so I'm very flexible with the type of music or whether it's on or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you think of any other ones? Or I'll keep going.
I think a lot about the client's own story and how it connects to how they present to me that day. Even if they come in and, the initial complaint is my shoulders hurt. If they start telling me a story about how they've had a history of domestic violence in their relationships and they're telling me, context. A person is more than just their symptoms. I'm never going to look at someone and say, well, we're actually talking about your shoulders here. It really is seeking to understand the person who's in front of you right here is more than just what they're experiencing. They're trying to communicate with you about what has brought them to this point.
Yes.
And giving them the space to paint their own picture of who they are to you and what you need to understand in order to provide them the care that they require. I'm never going to shut someone down on a story that is important for context. Maybe it turns into a story about how, those experiences affect the brain, how our brain affects our body positioning and our safety and how that affects our fascial tissue. Maybe we all try to participate and connect it together. But it's also about how I position them on the table if I'm doing, forms of manual therapy. If I'm guiding them through a body scan, I invite them to close their eyes. I don't say, close your eyes now. If I say, I want to get to this part of your body here, is it okay if I go underneath your shirt? Is it okay if I position you in this way? If this becomes overwhelming at any time, just know that you can let me know. And I'm here if you start to feel emotional or worked up. I'm here to provide support, or I'm also okay with leaving the room if you prefer to self-soothe, if you feel those things coming on. And I think this plays an important part in healthcare overall, because I think we don't act like we are the authority figure. We may be here to provide a service and provide education and knowledge about something they want to know more about. That doesn't mean that I'm the boss of you, and you have to do everything that I say. I'm here to offer a professional recommendation. I'm here to offer some extra insight that would be helpful to you. And it's okay for you to tell me that that wasn't helpful. Is there something else that you might recommend? What I don't want is to give someone an exercise and for them to come in and be like, oh, you said do this and I didn't do it. And I'm sorry. What we didn't do is learn how to fit that into your life more appropriately. Maybe we can work with that. But I'm not here to scold you about how you didn't do what I told you to do. That therapeutic relationship is really at the core. And that's what I love about OT, is we focus on that therapeutic relationship and the context of each individual as we seek to improve their abilities and their participation and their engagement and all of these other things that provide levels of meaning and purpose to their life. Hello, spirituality, come back into play.
Maddie's circling back.
Circling back again.
Maddie did a little manual therapy for me before we did this podcast today, and Maddie's excellent at checking in. Is this pressure okay? How are you feeling? How is your body responding? So I think that's another important layer. I was also thinking about when people are face down, and I always want people to know where I am. So I'm either showing them where I am through, I keep a hand on them as I'm moving around the table, or I'm talking, so I'm using my voice so they know where I am. And so nobody's surprised. And I did surprise a client the other day who was laying face up. She had her eyes closed, and I was working on the left side of her body. And I got up and I moved over and I was going to the right side of her chest, and I put my hand on her clavicle, and she jumped because she didn't know where I was. And I didn't do a good job of letting her know. And she's been a client for years, but she still jumped when I put my hands on her because she has a history of trauma.
Yeah.
So making sure that, and we're not perfect, obviously, I just disclosed, but remembering to do those things is another important piece, I think.
Yeah. And I think as, any sort of healthcare practitioner that you are, it's okay if you're not absolutely perfect all the time. I think having these moments of reflection, circling back and doing those self-checks after these times that you're with your patient, like, could I have done something different to make this experience more therapeutic, or I will need to integrate, this next time, or, I wasn't aware of that, but now I am, so I can do better. As a person in healthcare, you have to give yourself the grace to learn and grow. And learning and growing is about, sometimes we aren't the most perfect at being trauma-informed, but we all have the ability to try again and do better and learn from those experiences to the benefit of our patients and our clients and those that we care for.
I'm trying to think of any other ones. I think you sort of alluded to this when a client comes in at every single visit, regardless of what they started with us for. The question is always, what's going on? Tell me what's going on with you, and where do you want to focus today?
Yeah.
And let them drive the session rather than our treatment plan.
Yeah.
The other one is we don't rush people. We put lots of time in between our client visits, 30 minutes typically, and that allows us to slowly wrap up and not rush people out the door. And if they have questions, we can answer them. The last podcast, I talked about the matching, pacing, leading, and that's something you can use, that we use throughout our sessions to match that client where they're at.
Yeah.
And then try to regulate the nervous system with the process of pacing. But they always get to drive. And that circles back to conversations too.
Yeah.
If they want to be quiet, we're quiet. If they want to talk, we talk. We listen.
Yep.
So
I have some of my best conversations about trauma and trauma-informed care with clients that want to talk about it. I've also worked with some Gen Z clients where I'm like, this person's going to feel even more awkward if I try to start a conversation with them about the weather. So I'm just going to guide them in some deep breathing. We're going to focus on relaxation. And then, I will check in and see how they're feeling. I will let them know what I'm doing with my body around their body. Just like you mentioned, matching what that client is experiencing. Like if my client comes in and they tell me, my shoulders are really sore, but I got a lot on my plate right now because, I think I'm going to lose my job. Whew, okay. I'm not here to be like, well, let's get back to your shoulders.
right. It's all,
Yeah.
it all is all integrated. Okay, I think this may have to be a two-parter, Maddie. We're up almost an hour and a half.
I just have so much I want to share with you all.
I think, like you started out with, I think a lot of our listeners probably know something about this.
Yeah.
From a probably a personal and a practical and a professional perspective. But I think it's always a good reminder, as you said, we have a duty, I think, as OTs and health and wellness practitioners to learn, to understand, to grow, and to be able to provide the best possible experience for our clients. We need to know about this.
Yeah. And, whether you are a client listening to this or a healthcare professional, let's talk trauma. All of this, the bad stuff will thrive in the dark. The more that we talk about this and normalize having these conversations, the easier it becomes to address these issues as they pop up around us, whether it be individually or in communities or in populations. And if anyone was listening to this and there's a certain area you really want to know more about, reach out and let us know, because we'd love to get in a little bit deeper. We covered a lot of general stuff today, but there's so much more to this that I can't wait to talk more about later.
And if you are going to the National Occupational Therapy Conference this year, when is it, Maddie?
AOTA in Anaheim, California. You can hear me talk trauma.
What day are you presenting?
April 25th at 8:30.
Okay.
So you can find my name, Madeline Seide, in the directory of the AOTA app. And I look forward to talking trauma with you there at the conference.
You're going to be there. Go say hi. All right. Thank you so much, Maddie. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Fascia-Informed Therapist podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out my continuing education courses, both online and in person. You can find them at fasciainformed.com. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to next time.